This is Kettering University.
Many of those in this auditorium are aware of who Bob Lutz is and the leadership roles he presided over throughout his tenure. To me, he is a role model, an individual who I've been looking to for inspiration for years. However, as a courtesy for those who are not fully aware, if everyone could please join me, I would like to have a visual demonstration. Mr. Bob Lutz started his career at General Motors in New York City after serving as an aviator in the Marines and obtaining an MBA at Berkeley. Soon after, he worked at GM's Adam Opel in Europe. For those of you in the audience who currently drive, own, or have owned a BMW, please stand. And continue standing. Mr. Lutz went to BMW after GM, where he was Executive Vice President of Global Sales and Marketing. He was part of the first 3 Series and 6 Series programs. He also helped champion BMW's current numbering naming convention. Finally, he successfully defended the current BMW logo, which you see today. Now, for those in the audience who currently drive, own, or have owned a Ford Motor Company product, including Ford, Mercury, and Lincoln, please join. Following BMW, Mr. Lutz moved to Ford as the chairman of Ford of Europe and executive vice president of Ford International Operations. While at Ford Europe, he led the Ford Sierra program creation before moving to Ford US, initiating the Ford Explorer program. Now, for those of you who drive, own, or have owned a Chrysler vehicle, including Chrysler, Dodge, Eagle, Jeep, and Plymouth, please stand. Mr. Lutz was the executive vice president where he reinvigorated product development at the then struggling company, helping develop the LH sedans, Dodge Ram pickup, and it's where he first conceived the idea for the Dodge Viper. Finally, if you drive, own, or have owned a General Motors vehicle, including Buick, Cadillac, Chevrolet, GMC, Hummer, Oldsmobile, Pontiac, Saab, and Saturn, please rise as Mr. Lutz, whose positions, if I name, would eat up really a lot of time, worked heavily on product initiatives such as the Pontiac Solstice, Cadillac CTS, Cadillac 16 Concept, Chevrolet Malibu, Camaro, and Volt programs, to name a few. These are just a few of the many highlights of Mr. Lutz's career. He currently is CEO of Lutz Communications, chairman of VIA Motors, and co-founder of VL Automotive. For those of you who are not yet standing, please stand and join everyone else, as every vehicle produced today have been in some way, shape, or form affected by the actions of Mr. Lutz's career. A career which emphasizes quality of product over quantity, and a career where the customers always come first. So now that everyone's standing, please join me and give a warm welcome to Maximum Bob.
Well, thank you, Alan. Seats, everyone. And good morning, everyone. Thanks. That was, first of all, I've never in my life had that many people sing happy birthday to me. And secondly, that was quite an introduction that Alan orchestrated for me. But, modesty compels me to say that I wasn't responsible for all those BMW, Chrysler, Ford, and GM cars. And the other thing is, somebody may be able to give the impetus for all that and push in the right direction, but the execution is obviously done by others. So I accept the career accolades on behalf of the many thousands of designers, engineers, and manufacturing people who actually created the good stuff and put it in production. It's a real pleasure to be back at Kettering. This institution is so very important to the automobile industry in general, and to General Motors in particular. And as you all know, it used to be the General Motors Institute. I actually attended it in 1964 when GM sent me to a 6-week wholesale sales training course at what was then GMI. So I don't think I'm a graduate, but I did attend one of the programs. By the way, that 6-week wholesale sales training course taught you all about automotive, I mean, not theoretical automotive marketing, but practical automotive marketing and how to work with the dealer organization, dealer contracts, et cetera, how order processing, and all of the things that you really have to know if you're going to be in sales and marketing. It was an excellent course, and it served me well for my whole career. What I'd like to do most here today, and the part I always enjoy most, is Q&A because it's spontaneous. And we'll get to what's on your mind right after you hear what's on mine. And I'm sure you've got a lot of questions on the automobile industry in general, how it's developing, the role of mechanical engineering in it, and other things that I haven't thought about. So we'll have a lot of time for your questions right after I have sufficiently plugged my book. But first, I'd like to share a story with you, which might sound familiar, about needing help with your homework. A young boy was asked by his middle school teacher to do a paper about childbirth. So he went to his parents and asked, "How was I born?" And, "Well, honey," said his mother, who was slightly on the prudish side, "the fact is the stork brought you to us." "Oh," said the boy, "well, how did Daddy get born?" "Oh, the stork brought him too." "Well," he persisted then, "how were Grandpa and Grandma born?" "Well, son," said the boy's father, now squirming in his lazy boy recliner, "the stork brought them too." The next day, the boy handed in his paper to the teacher, who read with some confusion the kid's opening sentence, which was, "This report has been very difficult to write due to the fact that there hasn't been a natural childbirth in my family for 3 generations." Well, the kid was obviously destined to be a problem solver later in life, just as many of you are. I'd like to just give you a little bit of advice about how to put the knowledge that you're acquiring here and the training, how to put it to good use. And it's not going to be automobile industry specific advice either. It applies to the military or almost any field you go in. Because this is more behavioral in nature, sort of how-to advice when you find yourself out in the working world. And the first thing, obviously, you have to do, you cannot be a leader if you don't know the subject matter. So no matter what field you're in, you've really got to immerse yourself in your subject, in the subject matter, know everything that you can possibly acquire about it so that you can, when you speak about it and have opinions about your subject, you're doing so with the self-confidence that comes from having profound knowledge in it. So that's number one. But once you've gotten there, once you know the subject matter, then is the time to be confident of your opinions and be confident of your beliefs and speak them proudly and loudly and repeatedly if necessary. I've long been a proponent of the says who philosophy of business. And in fact, I had thousands of says who stickers printed in General Motors when I went back in 2001 because it seemed like everything I wanted to do, somebody would say, "Well, you're out of process." And I'd say, "Well, why?" "Well, process says we shouldn't be taking this step yet. We should be taking another step first. And according to process, we shouldn't be discussing this until next March." And process is something that business loves. It's necessary to some degree. In manufacturing, it's absolutely essential because you've got to have repeatability and you can't have people making up new solutions all the time. But process, while helping repeatability and reducing variability, process is also a crutch for the bureaucrats. And I will tell you, 90% of people, maybe 95% of people who join large corporations are basically bureaucrats. They don't like risk, they don't like new things, they don't like change, they don't like speaking up, they probably don't like other people who do speak up, and they're very orderly. And they can read a spreadsheet and so forth, and they just love process, because anytime it gets messy, it really disturbs the bureaucrat's orderly mind. And I have to tell you, bureaucrats are not, they're good at administering things, but they are not good at leadership and driving change. So it really means that for you to make a notable contribution to an organization, you have to have enough faith in your convictions to occasionally say, you know what, I don't think we ought to do it this way, and then be ready to articulately defend your standpoint. Don't be afraid of new ideas. Be afraid of the old ideas, because the repetitive way of doing things, it's the analogy I always use. One of the worst phrases in the world is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Because that would mean that, for instance, in IndyCar racing or Formula One racing, if your car won last year, you say, well, let's not touch it. This thing is a proven winner. We'll just enter it again this year. And you know what'll happen if you enter last year's car in this year's event. You're probably going to, even if it wasn't broken and wasn't fixed, but in the new environment where everybody else has improved, that car will probably be in the middle of the field if it's lucky. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That is a phrase that protects the status quo and is an excuse for the bureaucrats not to do anything. Don't listen to stuff like, well, that's the way we've always done it, or that's the process around here, or there's a GM engineering directive. Boy, did I run into GM engineering directives, which if we hadn't questioned them and thrown them out, we would have been absolutely hamstrung in the way we designed all our new cars and trucks. There's a true story. How many of you remember about 20 years ago, the front-wheel drive Chrysler 300M, one of the LH cars? Very dramatic, very advanced styling. And when it came out, at the time, GM senior management, of course, I learned this story after I rejoined GM. When it first came out, the GM senior executives were stunned because the car was so beautiful and so dramatically styled. They immediately said, well, why can't we do a car like this? Let's get one and analyze it. So they very quickly got a black 300M and put it in the styling dome. And when senior management came to look at it, it had 95 yellow Post-it notes stuck all over it. And each one of the Post-it notes showed an area where the design or engineering or body engineering or dimensions or wheel offsets or whatever showed an area where the Chrysler 300M violated some General Motors criterion. So the answer for top management was, we cannot design a car like that because it's in violation of 95 General Motors engineering directives. Well, needless to say, I didn't do it all personally, but I had the team do it, is comb through these hundreds of engineering directives and ask why. And it's the old Japanese technique of the 5 whys. If you ask why long enough, you ultimately get to the root cause. And these directives were never created for no reason. There was always some reason that it was originally written, but then it went into the rule book and nobody ever questioned it. And some of them were, I'll give you another little anecdote. You know those ash receivers that you push, and especially on Japanese luxury cars, they were really nice. You just touched the thing and it triggered a little switch and it came gliding out. And then when you touched it again, it slid back in a really creamy fashion. And I was checking out a pre-production Cadillac STS, and I hit the little switch and the ash receiver went bang, it just shot out like from a cannon. And to push it back in, it really took a lot of force from your fingers. And one of the guys there was the senior trim engineer who was in charge of the Cadillac STS. And I said, "Did you see what I just did on the Acura over there and the Lexus, and now on this Cadillac?" And he says, "Yes, sir, and it's one of the proudest moments of my life." And I said, "How is that?" And he says, "Well, you were perceptive enough to understand that Lexus and Acura do not meet General Motors Engineering Spec 3B909664780. And I said, "Well, what is that?" And he says, "Well, it means that we have to test these mechanisms at minus 40 degrees, cold soak, and General Motors Engineering Spec says that any openable compartment inside the car must operate at minus 40 degrees centigrade." I said, "Right, okay, let's assume the guy is up in Bemidji, North Dakota, and it's a minus 40 degree morning," which, by the way, lately doesn't seem so crazy anymore. Let's assume he gets the door open. And now he's happily seated in the car, twists the key or presses the starter button, and happily the car leaps into life. Now you're telling me after he starts the car, and let's assume the power windows go down, and you're telling me the next thing he wants is a cigarette or a cigar, and that ash receiver must come out. And they said, "Well, no, but it's the engineering spec." And I said, "But think about how stupid that is, where you are annoying 99.9% of the customers, 99.9% of the time, at the risk of someday disappointing some customer at minus 40 degrees who happens to want a cigarette the minute he or she gets in the car." And it was this sort of wrong-headed thinking that just drove a lot of this stuff, and it's counterintuitive, it's against common sense, and yet this is the crazy thing, people don't question it. It's like, well, the Bible says, and it's almost like dealing with religious fundamentalism, and there it takes some heretic to say, "Well, I don't believe that. Let's get rid of it." And that's really where the definition of leadership that I like is people who lead are basically people who drive change. And you can drive change and be a leader at any level in the company. You can have 2 people working for you, 2,000 or 200,000, but leaders drive change in the right direction. So I always say you should be somewhat disruptive, because a lot of times you'll be in meetings and the boss would like the meeting to go quietly, and that it's heading in the wrong direction and a bad decision is about to be made. And then the boss says, "Everybody in agreement?" You have to hold up your hand and say, "Sir, I'd really like to," or, "Sir or Madam, I have some concerns with this," and then you sort of politely outline them. And you have to strike a balance, of course. You can't be so disruptive that nothing ever gets done, because you're eternally raising objectives and arguing and arguing. You can't do that either. Then you just become an irritant. And remember that a nice analogy is pearls in oysters are really caused by a tiny grain of sand that the oyster has in there, and the oyster tries to eliminate the irritation by putting these low friction layers around the little grain, and that is what ultimately forms the pearl. So the irritation does produce pearls, but if the piece of foreign matter that's inside the oyster is too big or too jagged, it's not going to form a pearl because the oyster figures out how to get rid of it. And that's the same thing that any company will do if the person is too disruptive. So you have to kind of strike the right balance, and I will freely admit that in my career I often didn't have the right balance, but it is by and large, if you just remember that once it looks like you've lost that particular battle, they're not going to do it the way you want, the group or the boss is deciding in another direction, well, then that's the time to put your weapon back in your holster and say, okay, didn't win that one, and I'll work with everybody else to try to make it work as best as possible. So that's when you have to be an obedient and enthusiastic employee. One of my mottos, because I've always been very self-confident of my opinions, but not always right, my motto, which my manifesto, which I proudly cite, is often wrong, but seldom in doubt. And if you freely admit that you're sometimes wrong, because everybody else knows you are, but if you freely admit that, I think in meetings like at General Motors, it gives people permission to question what you're saying. So you never want to be so authoritarian that you don't permit other opinions to be expressed. And a lot of times when we were in meetings and people would argue with me, I'd suddenly say, wait, stop. You're right, I was wrong. I don't know what I was thinking, but yeah, clearly what you're saying is right. So you've got to have not only strong direction and strong opinions, but you've always also got to keep your mind open for other viewpoints, because it isn't about winning the meeting, it's about doing the right thing for the company. Well, for more on that, I suggest you consult my new book, Icons and Idiots, Straight Talk on Leadership. It's really a study of various leadership styles, good, bad, and ugly, of the men I've worked for my whole life who influenced me at one time or another. And the reason I said men in my life who influenced me is because of some of the book reviewers. One female book reviewer said, yeah, this is an interesting book, but it's an outrage. All he does is talk about men. There's not a single woman in there. Well, I'm sorry, I just happened to never work for a woman in my life. I'm sure I would have liked to, and if I were still at General Motors, I'd be working for Mary Barra, and then I'd certainly put in a chapter on her. But it includes everyone from my high school teacher, Marine Corps drill instructor, Lee Iacocca, Rick Wagner, Red Poling at Ford, and so forth. And it's filled with amusing anecdotes, mostly PG rated, as well as what I hope are some valuable lessons on leadership for anyone in the automobile business or any other business. I'd like to share an excerpt with you now that goes right back to my first job out of UC Berkeley, which was with General Motors overseas operations in New York. And I was a senior analyst with GM overseas operations. My boss, head of forward planning, General Motors had a department in New York, General Motors overseas operations, a department in New York is called forward planning. I always found myself wondering about that name. Forward planning as opposed to backward planning. But, planning I could understand, but forward was one adjective too many. Anyway, Bob Wackler was going to be my boss, and here comes the excerpt. Somehow, somebody had neglected to inform Mr. Wackler that I had been hired into his small, presumably elite team, and this was to make for a stormy welcome. On my first day, I reported to him. I was immaculately dressed and ready to impress. I knocked on the open door, and a loud, deep voice shouted, "Come in, goddammit! Who the hell told you to knock?" He was a very big man in his early 60s, and he had the beefy, congested appearance of a former wrestler or pro football linebacker who had let himself get out of shape. His hair was close-cropped white. The prominent nose was flanked by pronounced cheekbones, which in turn formed a visual counterpart to jowls lower down on his massive face. When he rose, it was clear that his substantial frame was anything but agile. His head moved hardly at all on what passed for a neck, which was more a slightly thinner extension of the torso, blending smoothly into his enormous head. As I walked toward him, he extended a massive hand, easily the size of a medium-weight ham, and it grasped mine painfully. "Sit down," he grumped as he plopped himself down in his leather chair and fixed a steely gaze on me from behind a paper-festooned desk. "Look," he began, "I didn't hire you. I don't need you. I wasn't asked. But my boss, Phil Copeland, says I gotta take you, so I will." With that, he shuffled through some papers, retrieved my file, and began to read my resume, rife with business school academic speak, which I had naively assumed would have a killer impact on any future employer. Wrong. Bob Wackler enlightened me with the following. He says, "Look, I've read your fancy friggin' resume about 6 times, and I still don't understand what any of those long words mean. I guess they taught you a lot of newfangled, ultra-modern crap at Berkeley. Well, it ain't gonna do you no good in my department, because when it comes to the way we do business, we're in the goddamn Stone Age. And the best advice I can give you if you want to last more than a week is to forget your fancy education and just Stone Age it along with the rest of us." And with that bit of useful advice, Bob Wackler taught me all I needed to know about how GM operated in those days. Oddly enough, he turned out to be quite an effective leader, a bulldozer of a manager who got things done, like it or not. And here's one more from my time at Ford, where at Ford of Europe, Red Poling was chairman of Ford of Europe, and I was president of Ford of Europe. And Red Poling, I have to say, was the ultimate bureaucrat and the bean counter's bean counter. I mean, this guy was so quantitative that reality, logic, and common sense could not intrude on his numerically perfect world. One of Ford of Europe's most time-consuming meetings, this is the excerpt out of the book again, presided over by Red Poling, was that of the Project Appropriation and Approval Committee. It was the purpose of this meeting to monitor and approve even the tiniest bits of spending in Ford of Europe's then $8 billion empire. There were always hundreds of projects, and the meeting easily consumed an entire working day. Now, the projects costing several hundred million usually sailed right through because they had been squeezed, monitored, and combed through by corporate staffs from their inception. It was the small stuff that got all the attention. There was the new office chair for the Antwerp assembly plant manager. Rejected, resubmit. Why does a plant manager need a chair? He should be out on the plant floor supervising. I need an estimate of time spent in the chair, as well as reasons an equivalent chair can't be found somewhere else in the operation. The office chair was resubmitted 3 times, was rejected 3 times, and was finally withdrawn. Red used this as an important lesson to me. See, if you fight stuff like this hard enough, they drop it and we save money. And this is outside the excerpt, and I should have put it in the book and didn't, but at a later point, like months later, I visited the Antwerp assembly plant. And I was welcomed in the assembly plant manager's office, and there was his desk, and there was this beautiful leather chair. And I said, "How did you get that thing?" Because you dropped, you never resubmitted the project. He says, no, we got tired of resubmitting it. So when we knew we were never going to get a new office chair. So we had this one totally rebuilt. And that way we were able to use the maintenance budget and we didn't have to submit a project. And I said, oh, interesting, what did that cost? He says, about $3,500. Then there was the story of the crumbling parking lot at the Dagenham plant in the UK. One of the many lots had kind of broken up with age, causing vehicle damage, and it needed a $50,000 re-asphalting. So that one was, well, what are the other parking lots like? How come only this one? What's the downside? What's the quantitative downside if we don't do it? And if we approve this one, will all the others want new asphalt too? Tell you what, I'm not going to piecemeal this. Next month, I want whoever is responsible for the Dagenham parking lots to come in and give me a complete status report with aerial photos if we've got them. I'm not signing off piecemeal. I need to understand the big picture. So next month, when the Dagenham parking lot item came up, a small, timid-looking man in his late 50s got up, bearing an easel and many charts under his arm. This was before PowerPoint, obviously. He wore a white shirt, a greasy tie, and an aged blue pinstripe suit, fresh from the last of what looked like hundreds of pressings. Clearly, he was a man of modest station, and this was his big moment. He had no doubt told wife and friends that he personally would be making the parking lot presentation to Chairman Poling and President Lutz. An easel with the charts was put in place at the front, in front of the two of us. We were sitting at the bend of a huge U-shaped table. The pointers shook in the nervous presenter's hand. This moment could be his career highlight or his downfall. Well, 2 charts into the world's most boring presentation, the hugely overworked Poling went to sleep. It was not uncommon because he wasn't getting enough sleep. I slept a lot too in meetings, but not due to insufficient nighttime slumber. I routinely dozed off from sheer boredom. The presenter stared down at Red's sleeping form in disbelief. With panic in his eyes, he turned to me. I gave him a reassuring smile and, with a circular motion of my hand, bade him to continue. On and on he droned, going over estimates, plot plans, alternatives, photographs, and finally arriving at conclusions and recommendations. And thus, gentlemen, I conclude my review and hope that the information provided has been satisfactory. Well, Poling snoozed on, and after a decent interval, I smacked my open palm down hard, startling him into fully awake mode. And I said to the presenter, "You are to be commended on an excellent job. You've made your case, and I'm sure the chairman shares my opinion. Isn't that right, Red?" "Yep," he said, "approved." I've often wondered what that little Dagenham parking lot superintendent told his wife that night when she breathlessly inquired, "Oh, how did it go, dear? Do tell me all about it." Well, the book is full of what I consider fun and funny stories from the various eras of my career. Perhaps the ones from the Mad Men era of the 60s are funny, but they have a point too. They're all meant to illustrate the types of leaders I was dealing with, good or bad, and a lot of them, as you'll read in the book, people think that because the title is Icons and Idiots, that there are some who are icons and some who are idiots. And then people read the book and they ask me afterwards, well, who's who? Well, I leave it to the reader to make up his or her own mind, because I find that many effective leaders are a blend of being brilliant sometimes and completely idiotic other times. And it turns out that with many successful leaders, you have to take the bad with the good. And at the end of the day, you have to say, okay, he was hard, or she was hard to work with, pain in the butt, but look at the job performance. And that, at the end of the day, today we are, I think, because everything is touch and feely, was on the plane with a naval officer yesterday, and he was complaining that the Navy is getting all of these same consultants that industry uses, where everything is, let's treat each other with respect. There's no such thing as a stupid idea, really. And the whole thing degenerates into a day-long discussion session, and everybody is afraid to say, look, we can discuss this to death, but we've got to do something. I did that repeatedly, both at Chrysler and GM, and then afterwards the human resources people would say, you know, Bob, that's not acceptable leadership behavior. And I said, why? And she said, well, because you were supposed to wait until all the opinions were out on the table. I said, we don't have time for that. The purpose of business is not to have happy, joyful employees who go home every evening and the spouse says, how was your day at work, dear? Says, it was great. We had wonderful discussions all day long. It was really thrilling. Oh, and did you decide anything? No, but that's beside the point. We all had fun, and we treated each other with respect. Well, I have to tell you, that it may be politically correct, it may be the stuff that's being sold now, but it does not improve shareholder value, because there is a huge benefit in any organization to focus and speed of decision-making and speed in execution. Part of what happened to General Motors during the 80s and 90s is it just degenerated into a discussion forum, and everybody was afraid to make the decision. And when you've got an organization where leaders are afraid to make decisions, you basically have stasis, and nothing happens. At any rate, I think you'll find my book fun to read. I give a guarantee on that. Anybody who says, oh, it was boring, just send me a note, you'll get your money back. But I think it would be helpful. The same thing goes for your instructors, parents, brothers, sisters, friends, associates, distant relatives, email chain, Facebook friends. I could read other excerpts. In fact, I could probably read the whole book to you, but I'd like to hear from you now. So I hereby conclude my prepared remarks, and I think we have about 35 or 40 minutes for Q&A.
We actually had an online survey for individuals to put some questions on beforehand.
Okay.
So therefore, we'd have a couple to start with.
Excellent.
And then we have the individuals who are collecting the questions right now. That'll be brought up as soon as they have them kind of organized.
Good, okay.
So here are the questions that were given to us beforehand. The first one would be, the changes you made in your career, like going from one car company to another. Do you think that helped you become a better leader in the auto industry, or do you think it would have been better to stay at one company?
That's a good question, and there's a good case to be made for either one. But in my case, I think the varied experience after General Motors, at that time, undeniably or indisputably, the world's largest car company by a wide margin, and going from there to BMW, who at the time made 180,000 cars plus 20,000 motorcycles. So BMW at the time was about the size that Porsche is now. And obviously, an entirely different way of operating, much more hands-on, et cetera, easier to comprehend. And each of the automobile companies is, you could say, basically the same, and yet very different in the way they approach problems and in the culture and so forth. And I found that the experience with the way other car companies had done it helped me drive improvement in the company that I was now with. But what you had to watch out, because it was so deeply resented, and obviously I had to say, well, the way we did this at Chrysler, and you say that about 100 times, and the GM people get tired of hearing it, but it was necessary in my experience at Chrysler, especially, which was a much faster moving, more hands-on, less analytical, more gut-driven organization. That experience helped me a lot in kind of redirecting product development at GM. But then on the other hand, you get a person like Mary Barra, who is going to be a really good CEO at General Motors. She's a 33-year General Motors veteran, which, first of all, I like the fact that she was picked. I'm sort of a closet feminist because I have 4 daughters, but she wasn't picked because she was a woman. She was picked because she was by far the best candidate, and she's a 33-year GM lifer. And she knows GM inside and out, and that's going to help her a lot with the CEO position. And I think it's a vindication of the good people at General Motors, because you'll recall a couple of years ago, the papers were full of, oh, they're all bums, they're all hopeless, the culture is terrible, these people, it's the gang that couldn't shoot straight. We're going to have to bring in people from outside. And the word early on was, well, the next CEO after Dan Akerson will be from outside too, because these GM lifers don't have a clue. And after all that stupid talk, they picked Mary Barra, who was a GM lifer. So I think you can make arguments in both directions, but there's no question that a culture like General Motors needed shaking up, and General Motors probably should have had an outside CEO before Dan Akerson and before Ed Whittaker and before Chapter 11. So anyway, I could argue both sides of that one, but in my particular case, it helped.
Here's another question. How important are mentors, and who was your first mentor? And then how did you and your mentor begin your relationship?
Well, I never had mentors. I don't think I was amenable to that. And I had quite a few people who gave me advice, some of it good, some of it bad, but I never had a career-long mentor. And I think the mentorship thing is okay, but you have to watch that it doesn't become a dependency relationship. And to the extent that the mentor, the nickname for mentors in General Motors was Godfather. It says, some person was moving very fast, and you say, well, he's certainly moving fast. Yeah, well, Vice President so-and-so is his godfather. And that tends to be resented in the company. And I think what you do, rather than have a mentor, if you have a good boss, your immediate superior will be your mentor, because he or she will tell you when you're off track. If they're honest, they will criticize your performance. And I always approached every assignment I had like it was going to be the last assignment of my career. I never viewed anything as a stepping stone. If you start looking at your job as a stepping stone, that means you're already focused on the next job and the next job after that, and you want to get out of this one as quickly as possible and do as little damage as possible. And I'll tell you, that is not the way to be successful. The way to be successful is to get your heart and mind into your current job, make and have it viewed as a milestone that people are going to say, boy, that's the best anybody has ever done in that particular job. If you do that, the next one is automatic, and the one after that is automatic. But always stay completely focused on the job you're doing. Somebody interviewed Mary Barra the other day, and they asked her, did you ever ask for a raise or a promotion? And she said, no. And I thought, you know what? I thought back on my career, never once did I discuss compensation or my next assignment with one of my superiors. I just assumed if I did a good enough job, compensation was going to take care of itself, and it always did. So mentors, I can see if you're in a minority. say you're African American and there is an African American vice president that serves as a role model for that particular minority. That works. And I think there was probably a time when female engineers and female executives could use mentors, but I think that's I think we're beyond that now.
And that actually partially answers that stems into another question. A lot of the students in the audience today would like to get into, let's say, positions like where Mary Barr is sitting right now, or where and who want to become like top management positions later in their career. And what further advice would you like to give them?
Well, it's like when I joined the Marine Corps, which at the time had 300,000 people in it. The drill instructor explained that there is one commandant of the Marine Corps, and there's 300,000 of you guys. So don't make that job your career goal and be disappointed if you don't get that. There's only one way you're going to get to a Mary Barra or Marchione or Alan Mulally job, and that is through demonstrated leadership capability in everything that you say and that you do, demonstrated superior performance in every job, and showing enough intellectual potential and enough energy and drive and enough ability to motivate and influence the people around you that you will advance step by step, and ultimately you will achieve a position of very senior leadership. I will bet you, if you asked Mary Barra whether 5 years ago she had even a faint dream of being CEO of General Motors, she would say, "Are you kidding? It never entered my mind." And I would say that when she was told that she had been selected by the board to succeed Dan Ackerson, I think she was more surprised than anybody else. So again, it's job performance and proven leadership capability. And I have news for you. Leadership is kind of like art, painting, playing a musical instrument, in that it can be taught up to a point. A person who is deficient in leadership traits can go to leadership training and become a lot better. Just like a person who is not gifted at the piano can, with enough instruction, be taught to play reasonably well. But that person is never going to become a concert pianist. And I do believe that leadership skills, which is closely allied to the ability to communicate and paint your vision in a very tangible way that everybody else can grasp and share. Not everybody has that ability, and some of the people have the ability and abuse it. That's like con men who are very convincing, or Kwame Kilpatrick of Detroit. He had very positive leadership traits in that he had command presence, he spoke well, he was extremely articulate, he was very intelligent, he was forceful, but he lacked one key ingredient, which is called integrity. So integrity is the bedrock of it all. You can develop your leadership traits, but it takes work. It takes it takes the willingness to speak up and be articulate. And that's why I say to especially engineers, the word is usually, well, engineers don't write very well. And we don't have to, because we engineer things. We don't have to write. Well, I have news for you. If you want to advance to senior positions, you better learn how to express yourself in writing.
Now, at a position at your level, the amount of time commitment required is enormous. Were you ever concerned with balancing work and family, and then how were you able to manage that balance?
Well, The short answer is, I've had 3 wives. And this whole thing of work-life balance is this entirely new concept that's come up in the States and in other countries as well. And it's, again, in this direction of touchy-feely, we're not here for job performance, we're here to lead a balanced life. Well, I'll tell you, the shareholder has no benefit from your family relationship. One's family relationship should be just good enough to where it doesn't disrupt your work at the company. And I will say that I probably devoted too much time, too much energy, too much passion to the job side of the business and somewhat neglected my wife and my kids. And my daughters are all in their 50s now, but I do hear about it regularly. You know, Dad, we never did anything, we never went anywhere. And that's probably partially true. Would I do it differently if I had to do it all over again? Probably not. Because the truth of it is, I was more passionate about my job in the automobile business than I was about the family. And then the other female reaction to this will be, what a sexist thing to say, and you're absolutely right, because back then I was. Since I had daughters, I figured I'll let my wife deal with it. And she did admirably. But this work-life balance is something that everybody has to figure out for yourself. But when we wanted, for instance, at General Motors, we had some very, very super promising people. Wanted to give them a 2-year assignment at Shanghai GM. And you get these guys and women who were destined someday to be at least a vice president, maybe an executive vice president, maybe even president. I mean, people with tremendous career potential. Say, no, I really don't want to go because my daughter is a junior in high school. I say, and? Well, we can't, my wife and I discussed it, we can't tear her away from her social circle in high school and sort of plop her into an all-new environment. You can't? Why not? That happens to kids whose families are in the military routinely every 2 years. When I was the 11 years I spent in the Marine Corps, my wife and kids had to move every 2 years. Once I was at General Motors, it was no longer every 2 years, it was more like every 3.5 years. But it was, and I can't tell you how many schools my kids went to. But you know what? They've got former schoolmates in Paris, former schoolmates in Frankfurt, and former schoolmates in London, and it's made them more effective adults. So don't overdo it on the family side. If you are the breadwinner, regardless of whether you're the female or the male, at some point for your career advancement, which is basically also good for the family, you have to say, look, honey, I know you've just been elected president of the Bridge Club, but this is an important move for me, and we're going. And if he or she says, gosh, well, I'm not going, well, then you know that the marriage wasn't that good in the first place. And I'd like to say, the Marine Corps used to say, don't worry about it, the government will issue you a new one.
Now, when you arrived at General Motors in, I believe, 2001, you helped make initiatives like the new Chevy Malibu and the Cruze Aura possible. But as the culture at the time at GM was a lot different, and the cars that were produced at the time were, let's say, not. They were pretty bad. And
mediocre. Balanced mediocrity was the phrase that I liked.
So, what do you view as the most challenging part of changing that culture to try and bring these vehicles to light?
Yeah.
And
It was just endless arguing, and I was sort of helped by market research, because when I got there, the first thing I asked for was the results of the design clinics of all of the cars that we were either just launching or had launched. And the first thing I heard was, well, we can't give you those because it's confidential. I said, well, who does get to see them? Well, the vehicle line executive is the only one who's allowed to see the market research results. And I said, well, I have news for you. The 12 vehicle line executives all report to me. So I am hereby demanding that I get these research reports. That, well, it's against the process. I said, I'm in charge of product development, and I am hereby modifying the process. I would really like to see those reports on my desk by Friday so that I can study them over the weekend. I got them over the weekend, and they were disasters. I mean, all of those cars that were out there, like, dare I say, Pontiac Aztek, which was, that never should have seen the light of day. And there were others too, like the Malibu before the 2007 Malibu had failed completely in the research, and a lot of other cars had failed. And they weren't even competitive, and yet they were allowed to proceed to production. And when the vehicle line executives were asked, how did it do in research? They said, did okay. Because one of the main criteria for vehicle line executive success was, is the program on time? And for a while there, you'll recall about maybe 15 years ago, GM had a lot of delayed launches, and the corporate edict came down and said, from now on, everything's going to be launched on time. And that's going to be a major measurement criterion for the vehicle line executives. So if the research report came back that the styling is a hopeless disaster, if the VLE asked for a redo, it was going to cost him 3 months of timing. And they didn't want to do that. So, and here was the terrible thing. The focus, and this was the part that I had to change. A vehicle line executive's objectives were all quantified on a huge sheet, and there were about 40 boxes. It was parts reuse from prior model, cost, weight, fuel economy, number of hits per die, number of die sets used, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was just all these quantified objectives, and they were labeled red, yellow, green. So a vehicle line executive would go through the program on time, and it'd be solid green. Car wasn't any good, but it met all of the numerical criteria. So I had one VLE come to me and say, we had this special incentive pot for vehicle line executives who had been particularly successful. And he said, I really would like to have some of that incentive money. And I said, why? And he said, because this is the most perfect program in the recent history of General Motors since we've had vehicle line executives. Why do you say that? He said, because look, here's my scorecard, 40 out of 40, all green. And I said, how's it doing in the marketplace? He said, it's not doing at all well in the marketplace, but that wasn't one of my objectives. And I said, this is crazy. So I called all the VLEs together, and I did it both in writing and verbally, and I said, listen, folks, I have news for you. I don't care how you've been measured in the past. That's all out the window, and we can keep the quantitative objectives on the red, yellow, green sheet if we want to. I have no objection to that. But let me tell you, in the future, you are going to be measured on one criterion above all others, and that is, how well is the vehicle doing in the marketplace, and is it meeting its financial objectives or not? And I don't care if you're $1 million over in investment. I don't care if you're $200 over on the variable cost objective. If the car is a winner, all is forgiven. But if the car is a flop in the marketplace, I don't care how many green check marks you've got down that list, you have failed. And everybody looked at me in stunned disbelief and said, boy, we've never heard this before. But that was basically changing the measurement criterion from a bunch of internal objectives which mean nothing to the customer, and changing the objective to being a success with the customer. And once you got that done, and I think that has lasted at General Motors, because I was no longer there when the new C7 Corvette was done, which is, I think, the pride of, not only the pride of General Motors, it's the pride of the American automobile industry. The new Cadillac CTS, the new Chevy Impala, and all of that. Those were all executed after I left. And I look at those cars and drive them and read the reports, and I honestly, if I had still been there, I wouldn't have been able to do any better than those. So I think that customer-focused ethic is now thoroughly embedded at General Motors. In the old days of pinching pennies and skimping on cost and going with the low-cost supplier and using cheap materials on the interior, those days are gone.
So, because of our time, just got one more question, and it's, if you could do it all over again, all the companies, all the experiences, would you change anything?
Yeah, I get asked that frequently, and I sometimes ask myself, if I had been less vocally critical and less in-your-face critical of Lee Iacocca, to where he didn't feel so insecure around me, to where he decided his management succession program was labeled ABL, and ABL stood for anybody but Lutz. And if I had been a little bit more diplomatic and a little bit less critical of my boss, I probably would have wound up as CEO of Chrysler Corporation. That would have been great. But then I would have been retired at age 65, and after being CEO of Chrysler, how can you go to work for another automobile company after that? So that would have been the end of my career, and I would have missed out on the great 10 years as vice chairman of General Motors, which was, arguably the best job I've ever had. So I would have missed out on that. So, and then the other thing is, you can only pretend to be something that is not really you. Like in the days of red polling at Ford, the corporate psychologist constantly pulled me aside and said, you know why red polling doesn't like you? And I said, no, I can't figure it out. Red polling doesn't like you because you always seem to be able to see the answer quicker than anybody else, and you're not using numbers to get there. And I said, this is bad? Well, yes, it's bad in the eyes of red polling, and you should try to be much more analytical and spout a bunch of numbers like he does, and try to make it look like it's fact-based rather than opinion-based. So I tried that for about 6 months, and I was not a happy person. So ultimately, you've got to be yourself. And I guess are there mistakes I made in my career? Sure, I try to correct those. But all in all, I wouldn't change much.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks for